Classical Conversations presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortons, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today, my guest is Jerry Bowyer. He is the president of Bowyer Research, an investment, microeconomic forecasting, and corporate engagement and proxy consulting firm. He is a believer. He is the author of The Maker versus the Taker, What Jesus Really Said About Social Justice and Economics. He has a podcast, Meeting of the Minds with Jerry Bowyer. I definitely say check that out. He's written in the past for almost every major news agency. He's been on TV. But we are talking about his book that I really loved, The Makers versus the Takers today, and what are those philosophies, talking about the free market and things like that. So, Jerry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Robert. Great to be with you.
Now, how did you get into economics, and how did you start looking at it from a biblical worldview?
Well, I got into economics when I was a teenager and I was an atheist, and I was reading Marx, and Marx was an economist, I suppose, not a good one, but that was his day job, as it were. So that was part of the package. Then when I became a Christian, I realized that the Marxist economics, the socialist economics, had to go away with the Marxist metaphysics and epistemology. So probably because of that early flirtation with Marxism, I've been interested in the free market system ever since. I find economics interesting because it has a real world orientation. I also find it interesting because how do I put it? I mean, it's hard to make a living as a philosopher, and it's easier to make a living in finance and economics. So all of those things kind of converged. And so I've been an economist by basically my entire professional life.
Now, for those who haven't had a chance to read the book, what is the premise behind it? And what did you see that inspired you to go research what Jesus really said about economics? And just, I enjoyed the book. So just how did you come about some of these things that you found? Like Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is where they bought sheep to be slaughtered for sacrifice. So we both have that kind of connection with Jesus being the Lamb of God, our sacrifice, but also a place of economic activity that is related to that Jewish practice.
Yeah, I found that particular fact sort of late in my process, but it blew me away when I ran across that, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the house of bread. And we know sheep were involved, right? Because the angels announced to shepherds. But there's a certain amount of detail there, which, generally is not well known at all. So I ran across this in a Victorian author named Alfred Edersheim in his book about the temple. And then I confirmed it by looking at the Mishnah, the Jewish material. And it, in fact, is the case that Bethlehem had an industry. Every place that Jesus visits or is born in the gospel accounts is a place with an economy. And when we're talking about our own contemporary world, we know the economic story behind most cities. So I'm in Pittsburgh right now. And when people, when you mention Pittsburgh, people think of steel. If somebody's in, say, Manhattan, you think of finance. If someone's in Southern California, especially Hollywood, the industry isn't agriculture. The industry is entertainment. There are farming states. There are shipping cities. Baltimore, for example. Sure. So every, Boston's kind of a finance town with a lot of insurance. We all know those stories. We know that Washington, D.C. is a company town, the company's government, and the private entities around that government tend to be lobbyists or people who influence government or directly benefit from it. But when Jesus is in Capernaum or Bethsaida or Bethany, or in Judea versus Galilee, or being born in Bethlehem, or at Cana, we don't know their economic stories. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did know their economic stories. And for the most part, especially Matthew and Mark's readers, knew those stories as well, because it was a predominantly Jewish audience. Luke was a little bit more to the Gentiles. So
Right.
if I tell you a story in which somebody, you meet somebody in Pittsburgh and they're carrying a lunch bucket, you're thinking it probably works for a steel mill, right? Or if I tell you a
Right.
story where someone is in Manhattan and there's someone in a $5,000 suit getting out of a limo and going into a big building, you don't think, oh, he's probably a soy farmer, a pig farmer. No, you think that person's probably in finance. And if we read a story about a minister or a rabbi having a conversation with somebody on Wall Street, in front of one of those buildings, as he steps out of his limo in his $5,000 suit and goes into that building, and Jesus is making allusions to buying and selling, or borrowing and lending, we will get that there's an economic context there, and it will help us understand what he's saying. But because we don't know our Bethsaidas from our Bethanis, Bethsaida shipping, fishing village, but also import export for shipping, fishing supplies. Bethany, house of the poor, a city outside the capital, made up of poor people. If Jesus meets a Syrophoenician woman and we don't know that's, and they talk about dogs, and we don't know that the industry of Tyre and Sidon was purple dye, and that the purple dye was discovered by a dog and was the basis of their entire economy, we're just going to read it through our set of expectations, not theirs, and we're going to miss a lot. But if we immerse ourselves in the context, the political and economic context, then all sorts of things come alive. Like one thing that you just gave an example of, which is the industry of Bethlehem was breeding lambs to be sent to the temple to be sacrificed, to bear the sins of Israel. So Jesus is born in the city where lambs for sacrifice are born. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that's coincidental at all. I think that's really important. I don't think he might as well have been born in Timbuktu. It doesn't really matter.
Sure.
I think that does matter. And he's put in a manger, which is a place for food. And the name is Bethlehem, the house of bread. And he's the bread of life, he says in John 6. So I think the economic dimension is there. But because most biblical archaeology has been done really in the past 50 years, almost all Galilean archaeology has been done in the past 40 or 50 years. For almost 2,000 years, commentators knew almost nothing about the economies of these cities. Therefore, they were missing a dimension, which now we can add to our exegesis of the Gospels.
Yeah, so I love how you point out that Jesus's economic message, the farther he was from the power structures of the time, the more free market, the more kind of open and talking about the goodness of capitalism and working hard. And as he gets closer to, Jerusalem and Rome, those power places, kind of like probably much like Washington, D.C. of our age, where it's the, richest, most flourishing area of the country, although they produce nothing. Right. His economic messaging kind of changes. And of course, we see all the time on Twitter or X and, in the news about how Jesus was a socialist, redistribution of wealth and some of these things. But what did you see in Jesus' economic message when he was maybe in towns where they were more productive with their hands versus ones where they seemed to be more manipulative of the economic situation of their time?
Well, what we don't see in the former are any confrontations whatsoever about wealth. Galilee was an up-and-coming region. It was a growing economy. It was a lower tax jurisdiction. They had lower taxes in Galilee. So, for instance, the tribute tax imposed by Rome was imposed on Judea, but not on Galilee. So, by the way, when the religious leaders approached Jesus and asked him, should we pay taxes to Caesar, there's background there. Jesus is from a town that doesn't pay taxes to Caesar because Caesar never imposed that tax on them. Judea was a town that did pay taxes to Caesar. So it was a higher tax jurisdiction, which discourages growth. So Up in Galilee, it's more up and coming, a little more frontier. There's a lot of wealth being generated. Jesus grew up very close to Sepphoris. Sepphoris was essentially the financial center of Galilee. They called it the gem of Galilee. We've uncovered banks there. Now, maybe those banks were after the time of Jesus, maybe not. The archaeologists can't totally nail that down. But it was a financial center. It was a center of trading, and there was a lot of wealth. And we've even dug up mansions with frescoes. There's a famous fresco, they call it the Mona Lisa of Sepphoris. Luxurious items, like combs that are expensive. Jesus was around rich people in his neighborhood. And yet, where are the confrontations about wealth? I would argue that the confrontations were not there because they made that wealth. They didn't take that wealth. It wasn't a taking place. And so Sepphoris was a trading place. People would come from all around with their olives, from Nazareth, or they would come with their stoneware from Cana, or they would come with their fishes from Bethsaida or Capernaum, and they would go there to Sepphoris, and they would trade and they would make money. And Jesus doesn't say anything negative about any of that, not whatsoever. There are zero confrontations over wealth from Jesus in Galilee. Every single confrontation over wealth that Jesus has, he has after he crosses the Mason-Dixon line of ancient Israel, first century Israel, and goes into Judea. And then right off the bat, you get the confrontation with the rich young ruler. And everybody skims over the fact that he's a rich young ruler. He's a ruler. So I've heard ministers, and I've been interviewed by podcasters who say, yeah, it's sort of like, here's this rich young man. He's sort of like Bill Gates founding Microsoft. And it's like, no, he's nothing like Bill Gates founding Microsoft. Because no one came and had a gun to my head and said, use Microsoft or not. Bill Gates created something. He's gotten into a lot of mischief since then, but that's beside the point. Steve Jobs or whatever, the rich young ruler is not like those people. The rich young ruler, he's an archon. He's a senator, member of the Sanhedrin. At the time I was doing some of this research, he looked a lot to me like Barack Obama, a state senator, and then later a U.S. senator, somebody who used political pull in order to get wealthy. If somebody goes into Congress with $10,000 in the bank and they come out of Congress with $50 million in the bank, and they didn't have a spouse who was a programming genius or invented something, then something's wrong. And I think that's what Jesus is confronting with the rich young ruler. And there are other details in the text, like Jesus, you probably remember this part, that Jesus lists the second table of the law, the second commandments, but he adds, do not defraud, which is not one of the 10 commandments. Why does Jesus add that when he's confronting this man? I think it's pretty clear. It's because he was living by defrauding, which James, later, either Jesus's brother or disciple, people can debate about that, from Jerusalem writes the letter, the Epistle of St. James, where he confronts the wealthy elite for defrauding workers by dragging them before the judgment seats. In other words, they used a corrupt legal system to defraud workers. Same word in the Greek, and the only two times that Greek word aphisterio is used in the New Testament. So I think that this was part of the gig. If you were a member of the Sanhedrin, your business model was almost certainly, defrauding people using political power. So it's not like, you talk to Tony Soprano, it's like, well, maybe he actually has something legitimate over here, like a restaurant. No, the gig is corrupt, right? The legit businesses are kind of a side issue. The gig of being the rich young ruler and a member of his class was using political power to extract wealth from people via fraud.
And if the rich young ruler, gave up his wealth, well, he doesn't really have any way of feeding himself because he's gotten wealthy through defrauding others. And once you give away that wealth, there's not really any power still there, versus if you're a carpenter, say, and you give away everything, well, you can still go build another house for somebody or build another door.
Right.
That there's actual economic benefits that you provide to your neighbors, to your country, that give you that wealth versus taking that wealth.
Yes, and the rich young ruler would lose a tremendous amount of status. It would be very difficult for the rich young ruler. It really was a bigger sacrifice to him. I want to point something out, that a lot of people have looked at those passages in the Gospels and said that Jesus is urging redistribution. And I think that's completely backwards. The redistribution has already occurred. The
Right.
rich young ruler has already redistributed wealth from all of Israel through the temple system, because that's where they dip their beak in the most, through the temple system, through the money changers and a crooked racket there with legally enforced. It's already been redistributed. Jesus is unredistributing it. That's what, at least that's what he's telling the rich young ruler, or later Zacchaeus, to do. Zacchaeus had already redistributed wealth up to himself. Jesus is saying, give it back to the people you took it from.
Now, you said earlier that you were a student of Karl Marx when you were an atheist or before you were saved. Why is it that in communist countries it seems that all the wealth does get redistributed to the top and not to the people as they claim?
I think that no matter what you call the system, you can call it communism, you can call it fascism, you can call it corporatism, you can call it Keynesianism. But any system that centralizes economic power in the state will always redistribute upwards. The difference, I think, between, say, communism and fascism is that communism does more pretending that it's doing downward redistribution, whereas fascism might not be might not be telling that lie so much. Fascism might be more honest. We're putting it in the hands of titans of industry who can lead the nation, right? Whereas communism says we're putting it in the hands of the people. So there's a rhetoric, leftism in general, there's a rhetoric of redistribution upwards, but it's always a redistribution downwards, but it's always in practice a redistribution upwards. It always will be. There's no society in the history of mankind, no matter how much it talked about redistributing downwards. I mean, you read Orwell's Animal Farm, and eventually the pigs are going to move into the farmer's house and they're going to live off of everybody else. And Snowball goes off to the glue factory. That's what it's always going to be. And my argument that that's what it's always going to be is that ancient Israel was the best nation in the world. It had the oracles of God. It had 1,000 years of prophetic witness. It was the place through which the Messiah would come. It had the temple. It had the lessons, the teaching of the temple through the rituals. It had everything going for it. It fully confessed the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it redistributed wealth upwards in a corrupt manner. Who's going to do better than that? I mean, so tell me some European country that doesn't honor God at all anymore. They'll do it better than Israel that had the 10 Commandments? No. I think a lot of I'm with N.T. Wright that a lot of the message of the fall of Israel in the gospel is not, hey, look at the Jews, they're so bad. You know, that's the anti-Semitic spin on it. No. I think the message is even Israel has sinned. I think that's part of what's going on in Romans. Even Israel, in some sense, the best of mankind, the chosen people, even they turn to corruption. In this case, when they have political centralization of power.
So what would you say we have in the U.S. now? Because a lot of times people say, oh, we have a free market economy and look how it's failing everyone. I would probably lean toward more corporatism, but leaning towards fascism even now, potentially. What do you see is the U.S.'s true economic theories?
I'd say it's a mix. It is lower taxed than most developed nations, has a high level debt, but probably less than most developed nations. Probably. So, what am I comparing it to the ideal, or am I comparing it to the peer group? If I'm comparing it to the ideal, we are woefully short. Not just of what I think is God's ideal, which is a very, very small state, but even in the ideals of the founders, which was also a small state. They may have even conceded too much to a large state, in my opinion. I mean, I think if they were more fully biblically, engaged, they would even have come up with more limits for government power than they did in the Constitution, as much as I love the Constitution. So compared to what it should be, compared to the founding, it is bad. I would say that sometimes it's kind of like leftism in that it talks about redistribution downwards, but really redistributes upwards. So,
Right.
My friend Robert Woodson did some analysis where he said that 70% of money that goes to the welfare system goes to rich people who live near Washington or people who work for the bureaucracy. 30% actually goes to the poor.
Hmm.
So see, that's redistribution. That's a redistributionist model. We're going to give it to the poor, but the poor don't actually get it.
Sure. Well, that's like Section 8 housing, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you put a individual who can't afford a house into a house, but it's really the homeowner, the corporation that owns the apartment complexes
right.
that is actually
They're getting a subsidy. Right,
getting the subsidy.
right.
The poor person who's being helped is just really a pass through to the large corporation. I mean, like I think
Right.
I
Or a
don't know
lot of
the
public schools where there's an enormous amount of money going to consultants and bureaucrats. It's not getting to
yeah
the kids. And they keep showing us poor kids who can't read as if the money's going to actually get to them. It doesn't get to them. It doesn't really get to the teachers either. So I'd say we are mostly a talk about redistributing downwards, but really redistribute upwards economy. And it's so weird that the left talks about supply side economics and calls it trickle down economics because they're the ones doing trickle down economics. See, someone asked Harry Truman about two kinds of economics. Well, there's trickle up, give money to people at the bottom and it'll come up to the rich. And then there's the other one, give money to people at the top and it'll come down to the poor. But a biblical supply side or free market system would say, God's already providentially distributed resources. Now, let people use those, exchange them for goods and services, and maximize the value of them. We're not trickling anywhere. And whether it's trickle up or trickle down assumes that there's some central planner who should have that hose that decides where to pump the money. And by the way, how do we pump money into the system? We do it through the central bank, through the Fed. Ben Bernanke talked about helicopter money. We're going to put money in helicopters and drop it over America. But of course, that's not what really happened. With quantitative easing and all the stuff that we've seen since the Great Recession, nobody went and put money in my bank account or yours. They put it through the banking system. They put money into treasury bonds, and who's the biggest administrator of treasury bonds? That's BlackRock. So the money went to money center banks in New York to the largest asset managers. That's trickle down economics. And it's astonishing to me that gets pawned off to people as redistributionist or helping the poor. It's unbelievable. What happens is the money goes into those assets. The stock and bond markets go up a lot. Right. There's a lot of transactions for the companies that manage it. And then eventually the money does trickle down. But by the time the money does trickle down, it is debased. So the rich get higher asset prices. The poor get higher food prices. That's called the Cantillon effect. Whoever gets the money first gets the benefit. Whoever gets the money last gets the detriment. That's our system.
Yeah, and that's why we see such wealth inequality happen in the U.S., especially since we've come off the gold standard, which, may have been a more biblical way to manage our money. I guess there could have been issues with that as well. Like, what should we do as Christians? Because the Bible tells us to deal with equal weights. And in some ways, our fiat dollars are no longer equal weights. And, hey, I have access to capital and a better relationship with banking entities than, my poor neighbor or my poor church, person who sits next to me in the pew. Like, how as Christians, what should we be doing? Should we just be investing in silver and gold and trying to get a Bitcoin standard, or we just are put here at this time and do our best not to allow our souls to be corrupted by a debased currency? What would you say that we should be doing?
I would not put all money in gold and silver. I've long been an advocate of having an allocation to gold and silver, but not a 100% allocation to gold and silver because the United States economy is still incredibly productive. And it is hard for an inflation hedge to keep up with the productive capacity of 330 million people who are still among the one of the top 10 most economic free countries in the world. We're producing a lot of wealth. So to be 100% in gold and silver is essentially to give up on this economy, which I wouldn't. But to be hedged is a different thing entirely. And that hedge could be gold, that could be silver, it could be Bitcoin, it could be Ether, right? Or other cryptocurrencies. So I would say...
So we're still making stuff is what you're telling me, that we're still part of the makers.
I'd say we're mostly makers, but we're passing that 50% point. So there's still a lot of makers. I'm a maker, you're a maker. I mean, there's still people doing making. There's still farmers and manufacturers and people who are making, investment decisions, allocating capital to productive places. There's a lot of making going on. I mean, there's a point at which the tick gets bigger than the dog, right? And
Sure.
yes, we're not there yet, but we're getting dangerously close to there. So I would be more hedged now than historically. Most of my life, people have come to me to say, "Oh, we're about to have hyperinflation, right, Jerry?" And I've said, "No, we're not." What I saw on Glenn Beck, it's like, Glenn's wrong, and has been for a long time. You go back to Larry Burkett in the 1980s talking about the coming economic collapse. So Christians have been like way early on the economic collapse story, and I think it's because we sense that something is wrong. We compare to the ideal, whereas investors are comparing to the alternative.
Right.
So
the alternative is still more corrupt than us.
Precisely. So, people call the US dollar the least dirty shirt, in a rugby match, right? So where are they going to go? The euro, the yuan, the yen? No, maybe they'll go to gold, but you can't really transact in gold. So it's just a store of value. So it's not a monetary replacement until somebody does it. Now, I think I would be looking in that direction. I think we ought to be looking at non-governmental gold standards, private, gold-backed crypto, or even legal tender, because states have the ability to do legal tender if it's gold or silver backed. So I do think we need alternatives to the dollar, and I think that's maybe the way out of this mess. But in the meantime, as somebody who helps manage money and helps, I'm not an advisor, but I advise advisors, right? I would not say have all your money in gold or silver. I would say invest broadly because you don't know the future. That might be internationalizing a little bit to get away from the problems of the dollar. And in fact, I do recommend, I think most people are overweight to the US, underweight internationally. For most people, the market means the US market. When we're a fifth of the global economy. How many people only have a fifth? How many Americans only have a fifth of their allocation in the United States? I mean, it's like 95% usually.
Sure.
So I would be in gold, be in some gold and silver. I mean, obviously talk to an advisor, internationalize a little bit more. And yeah, if you don't mind the wild ride, some bets on crypto as a bet completely outside of the system, I think is a reasonable hedge. So I wouldn't call myself a Bitcoin maximalist. I would call myself a Bitcoin cheerleader. But thus far, it has not lived up to its promise of becoming an alternate currency. At this point, it's behaving like a collectible. You just hold on for dear life and just keep holding on. And because it's scarce, it'll be valuable. If Bitcoin doesn't figure out a way to be money, then I have to ask, what's the value? Well, scarcity. Well, so just because something's scarce doesn't mean it's valuable. It has to be useful and scarce. Bitcoin has to find its way to being useful. Now, there are ways it's doing that through the Lightning Network. There's ways to transaction in Bitcoin. They're working on technologies to make it more usable. But if I can't buy things with Bitcoin, it's not money. And if it's not money, then what is it? At this point, it's a collectible. But in the U.S. context, I think overseas, especially outside of legality, it sometimes functions a little bit more like a currency. So there's two kinds of outside of legality. There's evil stuff like drug lords and kidnappers, but there's also people who are fleeing persecution, who are using Bitcoin. So I think at this point, that's pretty much the only place where it's really functioning like a monetary alternative.
Hey everyone, if you're like me, life can get really busy and sometimes you just don't have a chance to read everything you want to. And that's why we have recorded some of our great articles from the 2025 catalog on audio. Articles such as What is Classical Conversations? The Need for Community, Is Grace is Sufficient? The Skills to Love Your Neighbor, and many, many more. So you can search Classical Conversations Catalog Podcast and download the audio version of these articles today. You can also go to classicalconversations/catalog-articles.com. That's classicalconversations/catalog-articles.com and listen to the articles today. You mentioned internationally, like what countries internationally are more on the maker's side that we might not be thinking about versus the taker's side?
Well, I would just look at the 10 freest economies. So Switzerland is historically a free economy, and Hong Kong is historically a free economy, and Taiwan is historically pretty free economy. Mauritius so I'd emphasize. I mean, this is a whole thing. Like, this is one of the
Sure.
things I do is, a couple times a year, help companies rebalance their portfolio towards freer places, because it has to be free, but it also has to be at an attractive price. And they might not be free in other ways, like homeschooling is illegal in Switzerland.
Right.
But in terms of business regulations, it's probably better in Switzerland than it is in the United States. So I think Ireland is, a fairly free country as well. So I think you tend to. This is not something someone can really do themselves. So I'm just, this
Sure.
is complicated. But I would say allocate towards places that are free, and especially when they're on sale. And right now, emerging markets have been sort of on sale, because the U.S. markets have gone on so much because of frenzy over artificial intelligence. But again, this is not something a day trader, I think, should be doing,
Sure.
because there's currency risk. So I would just say the expectation is where you have strong rule of law and good demographics. That's where the economic freedom. That's where economic prospects are best. To me, the best economic prospects in the world right now are in Africa, but those aren't public markets, so it's harder to tap into that. But as it's Christian, the faith is growing, the population is growing, and it's trending towards better rule of law. So to me, that's kind of that's where I think we're going to see the next great global economy come out of. Just as we're declining, Africa might be coming up to replace us. I don't think, by the way, it's China coming up to replace us. They murdered 500 million babies. How can they prosper?
Yeah. Yeah, they have some people would argue that they have a very significant cliff of elderly that's going to be coming up, and not enough young workers to support their infrastructure, right? Which is why some people think they're going to Africa and trying to get some of the young men in there to maybe take that over. So
yeah.
What you hear in the US about, like, hey, let's weaponize our dollars. Let's use our dollars to, stop giving it to, say, Netflix. I'll pick on them because they, support all these things that Christians don't support. Is that something that really works? Have you seen like these economic pressures by the Christians move businesses at all? And like, what are some ways that we can really be a full steward of these gifts that God's given us, so that we aren't just funding our enemies?
No, I haven't seen that work very much, really, except in a few high-profile sort of organic grassroots cases like Target and Disney and InBev, which owns Bud Light. But by and large, a strategic appeal to reallocate your spending away from people who hate you, or a religious shame thing, like you ought to be, only using Christian companies or something like that. I've never seen it be effective. I think something happens sometimes where people are so outraged, there's something spontaneous. Like that happened recently with John Deere, that had gotten way into hard left stuff. This is John Deere, right?
Right.
Where there's employee training where, a woman asks HR, what should I do? I heard two women at the office talking about them being uncomfortable with a woman in the office who they say used to be a man, and they're not comfortable with him in the bathroom. How should I handle that? And the answer is report them. I mean, that's John Deere. I mean, unbelievable. Same with Tractor Supply. Harley Davidson is another one. So there's been a little bit of success there with like very conservative customer bases who were unaware of the secretive stuff that was going on in headquarters. By and large, I think you should. David Monson wrote an article on this recently for World, and I agree with David that you should do business in places that it makes sense for you to do business for business reasons. So if dealing with it, now that might involve consciously doing business with people who do not hate you and hate your worldview, because there are risks of cancellation, right? So there are places where doing business with people that hate you is stupid. But there are times when doing business with people who hate you is actually smart. Their hatred of you is not manifesting itself as an actual business risk. So, you know, so I see a lot of stuff in the world of corporate governance and proxy voting and et cetera, where the proxy advisory services are definitely alienated from our worldview.
Right.
So, but we work with them to help create alternatives that aren't. But so sometimes parallel institutions are called for, and sometimes they aren't. And I don't think just like a grand ideological thing that says never, never do Christian parallel economy because you're not engaging with the world is wrong. And I think always, wherever possible, do business with those who align with you. Because somehow it's wrong to do business with people who don't align with you. I don't think that's right either. I don't think we're required to do business with people who align with our values. The Bible never teaches that. So I think we're really deeply into the area of prudence. Some things are going to make sense and some things aren't. So, like, for instance, if with web hosting services, there was a wave of cancellations. Yeah, you might want to think about moving to Cloudflare or someone like who doesn't have that history like Amazon does. Absolutely. That's prudent risk management. But, when I was younger, there was the guy with the fish on the card. It's like, I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, we're Christians, brother, do business with me. And it's like, no, I think we've seen that doesn't really work. And there's a new wave of that, which is I'm a Christian, so do business with me. Because you want to punish or you don't want to do business with people that hate you. I just don't think that's a moral obligation to only do business with people who love you. So I would not be grand in pronouncements one direction or the other. I'd say that God has entrusted you with resources. Don't waste them doing business with somebody who is giving you junk product. So, like, not subscribing to Disney might have nothing to do with punishing Disney. It might be that almost everything coming through the screen is cultural poison, right? Or you mentioned Netflix. Arguably, Disney's worse. So it's like, am I punishing Disney? I guess, but mainly I'm not punishing myself and my grandkids. So you might want to cut the cord for that reason, not for ideological reasons.
Well, tell us, what do you talk about on your podcast, Meeting of the Minds? Is that a weekly podcast, daily, monthly? And
it's whenever. It tends to be weekly, but then sometimes not for a month. It's very, very focused on issues having to do with ESG and DEI and talking to companies. So this is an area where one of the versions of don't do business with people who hate you is don't own companies that hate you. And so Christians have been screening everyone who has a Pride Day or whatever. And I think that was a terrible mistake to focus on that, as opposed to buying companies that you think are going to give you a good return and then engaging with them when they are at variance from prudence. So the main topic of that podcast is the battles that are going on right now, Tractor Supply, John Deere, before that Disney, before that JP Morgan Chase, the battles that someone like David Bahnsen or American Family Association are engaging in, Alliance Defending Freedom, to influence these companies and get them away from identity politics, Marxism, sexual revolution pandering. That's what the podcast is about. And mostly that's what my business is about right now. Most of our business growth at Bowyer Research has been about helping asset managers or financial advisors to take a look and say, it used to be, what are you investing in? Oh, that company's evil. You can't invest in that hotel chain because someone can rent porn at that hotel. Or you can't invest in Apple because someone can download porn on their iPhone or whatever. As opposed to, instead of what are you investing in, asking, how are you voting? Because if you do own Apple and you do own the hotel, there are votes coming up all the time. Almost all of them coming from the left, pushing these companies in a certain direction. And Christians and then their advisors are not tracking this at all. They're completely unaware. I won't use a name, but there's a ministry where they sent me their holdings and they're doing business with a Christian asset manager. And I looked at this Christian asset manager, and here they're voting against Israel. Here they're voting for abortion. Here they're voting against fossil fuels. Here they're voting for the woke agenda all the time. And we don't even know that they're doing it. So we're helping people basically vote in a way that's fiduciary, meaning for the good of the shareholder, which basically means to these companies, stay out of this dangerous politicking. So that's what Meeting of Minds is largely about. I interview a lot of treasurers of states, because you've got a lot of red states that are voting like they're deep blue states on their proxies, and they don't even know it. They don't even know how they're voting because it's an obscure and non-transparent system, and we help them vote the right way.
Is there a way, like, for me, I own some stocks and I get voted, and I'm a little bit connected with some of the people, and they're like, all right. I was like, well, I'm willing to take the 15 minutes it is to open it up and download and, vote my shares, but like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be voting for.
I know it's incredibly complicated. I don't see a practical solution yet for a retail investor. So we read those hundreds and hundreds of proposals to see what's going on. We read, because we're voting on tens of thousands of companies. So we do it so you don't have to. The problem is that we can't go smaller than an advisor. We don't have a system for a business where we can help you. If you have a financial advisor and the advisor does it, we can help the advisor help the clients, but we need to be dealing with an institution. We need a certain amount of scale in order to be doing that. And I know so many Christians have Christian financial advisors, and they'll talk to them. Just be ready. Your advisor is not going to have any idea what you're talking about. And so send them to me and we'll help them.
Yeah. So what's that like? I mean, aren't a lot of these Christian advisors using proxy votes? They're not even voting their own shares. So it's just whatever company is the proxy voter. Is there a way for me, like, say I'm invested with BlackRock, I'm not there, but they typically vote opposite of how I want to vote.
Yes.
Is there a way to tell my advisor, I want you to vote my shares a certain way or with a certain worldview? I mean, is there conversations to be had that way? Or
no? Once you're in BlackRock, you've lost control of the votes. But there is a way to deal with the problem. There's something called direct indexing, where you can like break apart that BlackRock fund, and then you would own the individual shares. And once you do that, you take back control of your vote. So let's say your advisor came to me and said, look, I've got clients who are in BlackRock, or they're in Vanguard, or they're in State Street. Those are the big three. Or they might say, or they might mention some Christian financial, or they're in such and such, and they're biblically responsible. It's like, not in their voting, they're not. I can tell you, for the vast majority of them are not paying any attention to this. And I would say that most Christian, most biblically responsible investing asset managers I've seen are way to the left of BlackRock on moral issues. But let's say the advisor comes and says, I've got clients who are using these funds. They're invested in these Vanguard or BlackRock funds, and they want to take back control of their votes. Then I would help connect them with somebody who specializes in direct indexing, so that your advisor come back to you and say, Robert, here's what we can do. So you say you're not in BlackRock. Here's what we can do. You're in a Vanguard S&P 500 type fund. We're going to get you out of that fund and have you own shares directly. And at that point, you take the vote back and you say, yeah, but I still don't know how to vote. And that's where we come in. We can work with your advisor to set up an account where we're voting in accordance with your worldview, and then giving you a report showing how you voted. That's our startup right now. We've got businesses that we've been running for a long time. They're on autopilot. That's the startup. But we have not figured out a way to do that for an individual investor.
And it's 401ks. I mean, there's so much money invested in the 401k system, and it's usually with one of those big groups, isn't it? I mean, is there anything you can do in your 401ks?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've worked with a firm called Vident to create CITs, when you're in a 401k, that's what you invest in, CITs, not ETFs or mutual funds. They're specifically designed for 401ks. And I know how they vote, because we wrote the proxy voting instructions for them. So if somebody's an employer, and so let's say you have a Christian business owner and they've got a 401k plan, and everything in there is BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, right?
Yeah.
We can work with them to help them create an alternative that people can opt into that would vote against companies promoting abortion, that would vote against companies selling mifepristone, the abortifacient, that would vote against companies debanking Sam Brownback or indigenous Avance, that would vote for companies, if they're oil and gas companies, to be oil and gas companies and do it unashamedly, to vote against proposals to divest from Israel, that would vote. See, so it would be basically the opposite of ESG, but not perfectly opposite, because once in a while the ESG group gets a few things right. Like they were right. Microsoft had a sexual harassment culture problem, right? So we voted for some of the proposals from ESG groups, say at Microsoft, about sexual harassment. I mean, there were ties with Epstein and everything else, but they're wrong almost the vast majority of the time. So yeah, that could be done in a so if there's somebody who's an administrator of a 401k plan for, let's say, a Christian business or conservative business, or even somebody who just wants Christian and conservative employees to have an alternative that isn't even really conservative, it's just politically neutral, then talk to me and we can help them get into that, an alternative that people can opt into that would not be capturing their vote and pushing a left-wing agenda that they don't believe in.
Well, Jerry, I want everyone to check out your book, The Maker versus the Taker, What Jesus Really Said About Social Justice and Economics. How can they engage with you directly? Is there social media, their website? We have a lot of business owners that listen to this. They might want to have you take a look at their 401k plan.
Yeah.
So what are all the socials, all the websites that you'd like people to be directed?
Yeah,
to?
I'm on X and Facebook and LinkedIn. LinkedIn is kind of the main business outlet there. So if they're on LinkedIn, that's probably the best way to reach me. But someone can reach out to me on X or on Facebook, and I'm happy to talk to them. Just kind of tell them what their options are. I mean, that's free, just to kind of help them understand, how this system works a little bit. Now, eventually, if they opt into a solution, there are fees. But what I'm finding is, in general, they're decreasing their fees when they go with a direct indexing option. So they're kind of ahead of the game. The other thing I'm finding is, for a financial advisor, they now have a value added for their business. If they've got clients who are concerned about the left-wing capture of corporations, or prospects that are concerned about left-wing capture of corporations, they offer something that's distinct, because I would say 99% of even Christian financial advisors are just not aware of this stuff at all.
Now, I just want to ask you one final question. If you could get all the Christians in the U.S. to change one economic behavior, just by saying it, Jerry says we all got to do this, we're all going to get behind and do it, what would be the one thing that you would like to see Christian conservatives change in their economic behaviors?
Be the most productive and reliable person in your community, in your business community, in your economic community. The main command, Christians have focused on the negative commands. Don't be greedy, don't steal, etc. But those are limitations on built around a positive command. Fill the earth, subdue it, exercise dominion over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, the animals of the earth, and over all the earth. And we get so focused on what we're not allowed to do. Are Christians allowed to get rich? Are Christians allowed to whatever? Do we have to go to every Little League game? All that stuff, and we're missing. And all the moral commands still apply. Like, I'm a Sabbatarian, so you don't work 7 days. All right. So I think moral limitations apply, but the thing is always the positive thing, right? You don't get married to not commit adultery. You get married to be married. And don't look at porn. Don't fool around. There's a whole bunch of hedges around a marriage. But the hedges are to protect the good thing, right? In business and in finance, there's the good thing. And Christians have lost the good thing. They've lost that it is a sin to be lazy, that we're supposed to be economically productive. We're supposed to be creating wealth, and we should do it unashamedly. We should, like Eric Liddell in Chariots of Fire.
Chariots of Fire.
Yeah, run if you're an entrepreneur or an executive or a business owner or someone who just a hardworking person and you feel God's glory, run and feel his glory and be productive and ask yourself, was I as productive today as I could have been? And then also ask yourself, well, were my motives wrong? Was I greedy? Ask, did I violate the moral law? But before all of that, the first commandment was to exercise dominion. Let's get focused on that again.
I love it. And let's always do our best so we'll serve in front of kings. And of course,
Yes.
if Christians are the most economically viable, reliable parts of our community, we can fulfill that creation mandate that he gave us.
Amen.
And so let's do it. All right. Jerry, thanks so much for coming on the Refining Rhetoric podcast today.
Thank you, Robert.
Everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Refining Rhetoric, talking about how Christians should look at work, our investments, our economy, and what Jesus really said about makers versus takers. So if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. Get active, talk to the person running your 401k, or if you have someone doing investments for you, find out how they're voting on proxies, because it's important that we steward everything God gives us as fully as possible. And that means being engaged and not just expecting other people to do the work that he's asked us to do. So in the meantime, be sure to subscribe, leave a review or a comment, and we'll see you next week. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortons. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.